We can begin with a chant of Om together 3 times. We have been studying Sri Aurobindo's synthesis of yoga and are at the end of the chapter titled The Cosmic Consciousness. In the journey so far, Sri Aurobindo has mapped out the big picture of the yogic process by which we can enter into and live in the cosmic consciousness, and the full scope of what the cosmic consciousness means experientially. Because, as we have seen, every experience has many degrees. Every experience can be entered into from many starting points or many directions, because an experience has many facets or aspects. Each of these facets or aspects can be an entry point, and therefore a comprehensive roadmap would include all of these different facets, and entering the experience from each of these facets, it would also include all the degrees in which one can realize and make complete that experience. As a result, we have such a fat book, The Synthesis of Yoga, going into some 800 pages. And in spite of that, Sri Aurobindo comments that he had in mind to write many more chapters describing some of the higher possibilities and the difficulties in the transformation, in the supramentalization of our consciousness. So, the scope of this is so rich, so complex, that it includes all possible human experiences and all the difficulties involved. And yet, Sri Aurobindo sequences these things with a certain spontaneity and simplicity, charts out a path that makes most likely for the fullness of the experience in the easiest and the most rapid way. And it is for this reason that this text is so valuable and will stand the test of time going forward many centuries at least. Sri Aurobindo observes, this is from one of his comments about his own journey, he writes, "It took me 4 years of inner striving to find a real way, even though the divine help was with me all the time. And it took me 10 more years of intense yoga under a supreme inner guidance to trace it out. And that was because I had my past and the world's past to assimilate and overpass before I could find and found the future." So it is an extraordinary statement, the evidence of which we see in the text itself, that in the spiritual development of humanity, going back at least 10,000 years that we still have records of, all the way to the Vedic age. Humanity has navigated many specialized, let's say, experiments of spirituality across different civilizations and cultures in different cycles of the ages. Certain special experiences have been developed, perfected in isolation, sometimes taken to an extreme of an exaggeration, just so that the full potential of that experience could be made as complete as possible. And then all these streams have been brought back together, merged, separated, rejoined in a complex weaving of the human consciousness to make for what we are today as a humanity, not only for what we are, but what we are capable of spiritually going further on. And in Sri Aurobindo, if he had to found the future, all of these streams of experience had to be synthesized, harmonized, and then, as he says, overpassed. Having absorbed the best that was possible from that, to go beyond its limitations, and then to formulate that which is needed for the future. And that is why, as we have seen so many times in the text, he makes references to various traditions, various past approaches, sometimes by name when they are well known, sometimes simply by describing their effort without naming them specifically, because sometimes they've happened in many places and many times in history. So even as this text describes the full synthetic path of the yoga, it is also a historical document, experientially also historical in what it contains. Keeping this in the background, we look back in a very quick summary for what we have been reading in the last one chapter or so, where Sri Aurobindo describes the easiest means to enter into the cosmic consciousness through the experience of the silent self. He explains earlier that one can grow into a cosmic consciousness by a sort of a gradual, slow process of opening and widening our consciousness laterally, expanding our mind, expanding our life energies, even expanding our physical consciousness to become more wide, more plastic, more open, more united with the universal on each of these three levels, integrating at each step our evolution with all the rest of the lower levels. And this would be a relatively slow process, but very thorough and very detailed. In a sense, this is what the slow evolution of nature is taking us through. We are, as he has explained before, going through the unconscious yoga of nature, where nature forces us to grow, to develop, to go beyond our limitations and boundaries in a gradual journey in which, if you observe very carefully, and it's obvious when you look back at your life, every problem that you faced came precisely at the right time, pushing you precisely at the right weak point to evoke in you the necessary growth. And when that growth has sufficiently taken place, the problem changes and there is a squeeze from another side, compelling growth in a direction which was not so developed, or compelling integration of two different parts which are still divided, and so on. There is a kind of a deep wisdom in life, or in the processes of life, which takes us through this kind of a slow, unconscious yoga of nature. When we have sufficiently grown, when we come to the brink of awakening, we realize what is happening, then we want to take charge, or we want to speed up the process And that's when we take on the conscious yoga, which this whole thing is about. But he says in the conscious yoga, the methods, the means we use are not different from nature's methods. We take the same methods but intensify, compress, speed up the process. And so the conscious yoga is not unnatural, but it is much faster. And the speeding up can be often 100-fold or 1,000-fold, depending on the approach that we take. And especially in a yoga such as this, where we rely upon the action of the divine, the help of the divine Shakti to break through, to develop and integrate more rapidly than we could with our own efforts. The process can be remarkably rapid and effective, and bypassing the natural limitations of our mind, our energies, our physical body, the heredity, and all the past clutter and junk that we have brought with us across lives. In spite of all those problems, the changes can be so rapid as to be sometimes astonishing. So in the description which was given earlier, Sri Aurobindo points out that we can go through this process of a kind of a lateral expansion into the cosmic consciousness, but a more rapid way would be to have a concentrated pursuit going as high as possible, straight up into the pure spirit. And then from a consciousness now which is free of these lower limitations, turn back upon the lower ranges and complete the lateral opening along with the height that is reached, and thus reach to the most complete and the most wide realization of the cosmic consciousness by the most rapid means. So this being the description of the approach which he has taken in the text we are reading, he describes how at first the basis of the silent self is the most easy to place as foundation, and then from there the stages by which we learn to re-embrace the positive side, the active side of Brahman and the world, and the integration of these two making for the cosmic consciousness itself. Having brought us to that, he discusses the role of the individual consciousness in this cosmic state that we are in, how these are integrated, and then from there, how one can assist this lateral movement of the individual mind opening to the universal mind, individual life opening to universal life, and even the individual physical consciousness experiencing its oneness with the physical universe. And at this point, there is a very interesting passage of how the individual person is almost like a frontal edge of the whole cosmic consciousness. It experiences and perhaps at first even suffers with what it is identified with in the universe. But gradually, the higher freedom of the liberated consciousness can imprint itself on this and assist this individuality to free itself while still being aware, while still being identified with the universe. No more does it suffer. It shares in the freedom of the liberated state, and at the same time is able to participate fully without limitation in the expression in life. And it is at this point that our description, our study has come. The individual so developed in the cosmic consciousness is able to experience that divine compassion and helpfulness, but he is no more bound to the human and animal sorrow and suffering. But even having got to this stage, Sri Aurobindo explains that there is still a gap. Can you increase a little bit? There is still a gap that exists between the higher part of ourself and this lower part, where although the lowest shares in the freedom of the higher, although the liberated part identifies with the whole surface personality, there is still a gap because we speak of a higher and a lower. And as long as there is a higher and a lower, even if in the sense of a continuity, as long as there is a higher and a lower, the lower is always insufficient in relation to the higher. The higher is never able to express perfectly in the lower action. Something is still missing. And we have not attained to the complete perfection. How can we say that? Because for the divine consciousness, for the wholeness of the divine, the Brahman, although there is this experience of the higher, although there is the experience of the material, it is always free. It is always perfect. It is always unbound by limitation. And if that can be so, we also can share in its perfection. And so if we experience some gap, some limitation, it means the journey is not over. There is something more which represents the perfection of the cosmic consciousness. And it is to this now that Sri Aurobindo leads us. It brings us perhaps to the most important and in some way the most distinctive aspect of the integral yoga of Sri Aurobindo. So we read this chapter, which is the last chapter, we read this paragraph, which is the last of the chapter, Cosmic Consciousness. The link between the spiritual and the lower planes of the mental being is that which is called in the old Vedantic phraseology the Vijnana, and which we may term the truth plane or the ideal mind or supermind, where the one and the many meet and our being is freely open to the revealing light of the divine truth and the inspiration of the divine will and knowledge. If we can break down the veil of the individual, of the intellectual, emotional and sensational mind, which our ordinary existence has built between us and the divine, we can then take up through the truth mind all our mental, vital and physical experience and offer it up to the spiritual, to be converted into the terms of the infinite truth of Satchidananda. And then he says how that can impose itself on the mind, life and the physical existence till the lower is transformed into the perfect vessel of the higher. Now this is the goal for the integral yoga. All of our being, its lowest, its most dense layers, including the most physical part of our consciousness, must become eventually a perfect vessel of the higher. And by perfect, we mean with absolutely no limitation, no distortion, no darkness, no insufficiency of any kind. The higher should be able to act here as it acts in its own domain, without any limits. And this means of making perfect is what he describes here. In summary, which later he elaborates in much greater detail. But the summary here is extremely important, and although we have read just 2 sentences, within these sentences there are many complex ideas, many of which need some background also to fully appreciate. And so we'll take this up now in some detail. So first he speaks of this link between the higher and the lower. If there was not a link between these two, this kind of a perfection where the higher can recast the lower in its terms, or the lower can become a perfect instrument for the higher, would not be possible. And so this link is extremely important. If you remove the link, The universe is split into two. Cosmos is split into two. And the lower can never hope to attain to the perfection of the higher. The higher can never perfectly manifest in the lower. Life would remain always imperfect, incapable of perfect divinity. Now, it seems so simple when we state it like this, but when you look at the present surviving traditions, almost all of them have forgotten or eliminated this linking principle. So Sri Aurobindo takes pains to show you that this was seen in the past and is called in the old Vedantic phraseology the Vijnana. Now he takes trouble to mention old Vedantic phraseology because in the modern Vedantic phraseology, Vijnana has a very different meaning. If you go to the Sanskrit root, Jnana as knowledge means not just mental knowledge, the English word fails here, but experiential knowledge. So when you have Jnana, it means you have the experience of the thing which you know. It is not studied, it is not thought out, it is lived, and you are identified with what you know. That is Jnana. Vijnana, V as a prefix, suggests special, extreme, or going all the way to a specialization or perfection. Depending on context, it may simply suggest a specialized form or a perfected form of it. In this case, obviously, Vijnana would be the perfected, complete knowledge. Not thought out, again, experiential of what? What would be perfect knowledge experientially? We could imagine a human being and his knowledge growing. We could take the whole of humanity and its knowledge and grow unendingly. None of that will come close. The only knowledge which is perfect and complete is the knowledge that the divine has of himself. The way the divine knows himself, if you were to think of it like that, we can use the word omniscience, but again the English concept falls short. When we speak of omniscience, we think of knowing everything that exists. But that does not give you the sense of being one with all that exists. So the perfected jnana, vijnana, will be the divine as he is and as he knows himself entirely. It includes the concept of omniscience, but it's much more than that. When the divine is conscious of himself, and there is nothing other than him, is conscious of everything, including everything that is in the universe, everything that is not yet in the universe, everything that was, everything that will be, everything that might have been but might never be, all possibilities of himself entirely as he knows himself to be altogether. Meaning it is completely lit up, nothing is hidden from himself because all is himself. Such is the nature of this consciousness that we call the Vijnana, the link between the spiritual and the lower planes. Now, in the modern usage of this vocabulary, that's why he says old Vedantic phraseology, this is what Vijnana is. In the modern usage, Vijnana, the V, is used as specialized but not perfect. And so it is identified with the intellect. If you study any of the modern books of Vedanta, you will find the word Vijnana referring to the intellect. So they will speak of Vijnana as intellect as the highest development that is possible for the human being. And after that, what's next? Well, there's a big gap to the self beyond. And there is a gap here. So you can rise into the intellect, and of course the intellect, as you can see, cannot know perfectly. And after that, what do? You take a leap. You take a leap where you abandon this in order to enter the divine. And from the divine, maybe there is a light that settles into the intellect and the rest of you, but it's only a light. it's not the full divinity entering, pouring, or manifesting, because there is a gap. And because there is a gap, life can never be perfected. Life can never be divinized, or even the concept of divinity in life is ignored. Life remains always somehow insufficient, somehow limited in ignorance, somehow bound to suffering, whatever form it takes according to traditions, and must therefore be abandoned if you want to enter the full divinity and its perfection. Just this one word and the shift of its meaning has changed the whole perspective of humanity's spiritual potential. And so it is extremely important for us to bring back this correction. In fact, when you read the Veda and read Vijnana as meaning intellect, it doesn't make sense. Because the Veda describes Vijnana as the truth, Satyam, the right, Ritam, Brihat, the vast. Nothing of our intellect is like that. It doesn't know truth, it does not know the right, it is not vast, right? It does not fit the intellect. Only that, the divine knowledge of himself as he is, fits this description. So Sri Aurobindo speaks of this as the link. And in what way it is the link, we will shortly see. Is called in the old Vedantic phraseology the Vijnana, and which we may term the truth plane or the ideal mind or supermind. He gives you 3 words now. Why does he have to do that? Because again, we find our language is insufficient. And especially when we're approaching now through the intellect, as soon as we approach something which is so complete, we are going to catch an aspect of it, a facet, and then get stuck with that. So what he does is, he picks 3 facets, 3 aspects, and in the vocabulary, of course, the words represent these 3 aspects. We may term the truth plane. First is, it is a plane of consciousness. In the whole scheme of the cosmos, as the oneness multiplies itself, divides itself, and spreads out to become the whole universe, it undergoes a series of, so to say, self-expressions and limitations, all the way down to the most material formed universe that we live in. And these are 7 planes. Each is a status of the divine consciousness. Each represents a principle or a power of the divine consciousness. And all 7 merge into each other to create this complex reality of the cosmos. So the supermind is an entire plane in itself, bridging the Satchidananda and the oneness above in its perfection, and the mind, life, and physical consciousness below, which are all divided and bound in limitation and ignorance. And the Sat and the Vijnana sits in between, linking these 2. It is the one consciousness that knows the oneness above and the multiplicity below. In fact, we may also conceive of it as the Satchidananda choosing to concentrate on its multiplicity and bursting out to become the lower 3 planes of the multiplicity. This status is the status of the Satchidananda as it turns its awareness towards multiplicity. And so you recognize the supramental consciousness, the Vijnana, as a plane of consciousness in itself. Why is this important? Because it means that in our ascending evolution, it is one of the principles which is directly involved in the evolutionary process. Just as when we were still in the animal consciousness, to know that there is something already which we call the mind consciousness, to know that it exists would give to the animal consciousness the hope that yes, I can attain it. If you're told there is no such thing, well, what can you attain to? But when you say there is a mental consciousness already present, that you can open to it and invite it to enter into you and to form in you the powers of the mind. That gives you the hope and even the certainty that you can do it. In the same way that there is a Vijnana that knows this, that holds the perfection, and that it is just above the level of the mind, that it already has all that we are striving to realize, that it has in it the power to change us, that we have in ourselves the power to open to it, that there can be a mutual exchange between the two that can change things. To know that it exists and has that power makes possible the rest of our journey and gives to us that certainty. And the certainty is such, even if we did nothing and we just survived for the next few million years, we would get there eventually. But if we make that small effort consciously now, then it is super conscious. It knows us even when we don't know it. It responds to our call, to our aspiration, and begins to act from its end, to do in us much more rapidly than what we could on our own effort. So the fact that this exists as a plane by itself, as a power active in the cosmos, changes the whole game, the whole picture of our evolution and the yoga. And as a plane, it is the truth plane. It holds the full consciousness of the truth, the Satyam. The second phrase he uses is, he says we can know it as ideal mind. Now, ideal mind puts it in a vocabulary which we can understand from our perspective. Truth plane, wow, that's something way beyond anything mind could conceive. But how does it relate to mind? So the second phrase tells us the relationship from where we are to that ideal mind. And that means if we observe the working of our mind, if we observe the tendencies of the mind as they turn to their higher possibilities, what are we looking towards? What are we looking at for ourselves, for the future? And we use this word ideal. We're striving to realize some things which we call ideals. We believe it should be possible for us to reach complete knowledge, complete power, full illumination of awareness without any fogginess or confusion or clouding or limits. We should be able to reach perfect joy, happiness, peace. We should be able to somehow achieve perfect harmony with everything. Now, if you look at all of our dreams, if you're being a little negative, you might say fantasies, but all of our dreams are towards some kind of perfection. What makes our mind turn to those things? Not only we call them dreams, we also declare that we can never reach them. These are ideals which are utopian. The word ideal and utopian we put together, meaning you will never reach it. It's too perfect, impossible to realize. And yet your mind is tending towards those. And in the measure to which you approach those, your life becomes meaningful, worthwhile. In the measure to which you turn away from those ideals and stay bound with the status quo, you feel frustrated, insufficient, and you slide into a depression. Here's the interesting thing. Although we never seem to be able to achieve the ideal, even though it seems like we cannot reach the ideal, the very efforts to move, the small steps we make in those directions give us so much satisfaction that they make life worthwhile. And therein lies the clue. It means that for the mind, this is its swadharma, its innate truth. For the mind to aim at realization of these ideals is its raison d'être, its reason to be. And it feels fulfilled only when it moves in that direction. It feels failed and meaningless when it does not move in that direction. And so if for the mind to want to realize these ideals is its purpose to be, it means that somewhere along the mind it should be possible to realize that, the ideals. Of course, in practice we say, but it's not possible. The world doesn't make possible those ideals. There's always a gap. And that's why we call the Vijnana the ideal mind. Our mind as it is must move in that direction to fulfill itself, but in itself is incapable of reaching that ideal. Because the ideal exists in the supermind, in the next level, the next plane. But the purpose of the mind is to take us all the way to the brink of that and hand over to the power of the supermind. And so this Vijnana can be also described as the ideal mind. Everything that our mind points to but is unable to realize is there, just across the border, in the next plane of the supermind. And so he calls it ideal mind. So, Vijnana, which we may term the truth plane or the ideal mind, or now we come to the third word, super mind. Because now he presents to us this consciousness of Vijnana in its relationship with the mind. Not only the mind points to that, but cannot reach what it has, but the mind is formed out of that, and all of its powers are as if represented in the mind in some limited way. Our power to think rationally actually represents a power of the supermind which sees perfect order and right relation between everything without limits. You see, the supermind is, because of the consciousness of the way the divine knows himself, it knows itself perfectly ordered, everything in right relation to everything else, down to the tiniest detail. Our mind attempts to replicate that power in what we call reason. But the replication is defective. We take pieces, we try to arrange them rather than seeing the innate relation between things. And why? Why can't we see innately? Because the innate relation between things is infinitely complex, whereas the intellect cannot handle that complexity. So it catches pieces and it tries to order a few pieces and make sense or pattern or harmony out of it. And to whatever extent it can do that, it says, now I understand. In the same way, our intellect has the power of memory. But our power of memory is a secondary, reduced working of the supermind's memory. What is the supermind's memory? Well, it knows everything. Nothing is ever forgotten, remember? Because it's utterly aware of everything that it is. And so, in the consciousness of the supermind, all is awareness, nothing is forgotten, and all knowledge is simultaneously there. Or what you may do is to focus on some aspect of it more or less, but it's all there, everything simultaneously. Our reasoning mind is unable to handle that kind of infinity, so it can only hold pieces. And when it handles pieces, obviously there are pieces which are not in my current collection. I have forgotten. And I have to remember. And I have to turn into myself and draw out somehow the pieces which are missing and then try to bring them forward. And by a chain of association, draw more. It's as if you had a string, a garland on a string with many little, let's say, pearls, and they're inside the water. You cannot see where they are. You have to pull one to see the next, pull that to see the next, pull that. And so by chains of association, our finite mind is able to pull more of things which are part of the infinity that exists. Now when you begin to study in this way, all the powers of our present mind are reduced, limited, damaged, lower workings of that which is spontaneous and natural in the supermind, Vijnana. Therefore, Sri Aurobindo refers to that as super mind or supra-mental. But there's a deep connection between the two. If that is infinite, This is finite. And so everything gets somehow broken down to fit a finite vessel. If this can gradually widen out and open itself to infinity, all of its current functions would naturally align to the free working of the supermind and awaken to their supramental working. And so this third word suggests the continuity from here to that, gives us the conviction that yes, it is possible for our mental consciousness to go beyond its limits and awaken to this divine grade of knowledge, vijnana. So I will reread the sentence and you see how much is held by the use of these specific words. The link between the spiritual and the lower planes of the mental being is that which is called in the old Vedantic phraseology the vijnana, and which we may term the truth plane or the ideal mind or supermind, where the one and the many meet and our being is freely open to the revealing light of the divine truth and the inspiration of the divine will and knowledge. So it is this plane in between which is now the key by which the higher and the lower can be perfectly harmonized. What is needed now for this to happen? If we can break down the veil of the intellectual, emotional, sensational mind, which our ordinary existence has built between us and the divine, we can then take up through the truth mind all of our mental, vital and physical experience and offer it to the spiritual, to be converted into the terms of the Satchidananda. So there is a veil which has been created by our ordinary existence. It has built up a veil. And this veil he describes in three terms: intellectual mind, emotional mind, sensational mind. These three are separating us from the divine. Now, how this works? Our way of perceiving everything, including ourselves, is through these three filters, these three veils: the sensational mind, the emotional mind, and intellectual mind. The sensational mind is that part which in our evolution started with reaching out through the senses. Let's take the worm. The worm moving around on the soil smells, feels the dampness, the air, and makes out which direction it must move to get more of moisture, to get more of nourishment. As its skin touches the soil, it feels the nourishment and absorbs through the skin. This is rich, moist soil, a lot of nutrients. It moves a little bit. This is dry, bare, nutritionless soil. Move back. So almost the picture is of somebody who's blind and feeling and trying to make out a reality. But in each of these sensory contacts, you're constructing a picture, so to say. This part is more rich, that part is more dry, I must move here. This is too hot, this is too cold, I must move here, and so on. So through the senses, there is a mental operation which constructs the experience of the world. Now fast forward from the worm all the way to the human being, and you see we are pretty much doing the same thing. We are looking at our whole world now, not just through touch, but through sight, hearing, taste, smell, and touch, and constructing our reality. I look around and I see, here there is danger, this looks safe. And I take steps to navigate my life. But at each step, through my senses, I'm constructing an image of the world. The actual reality may be very different. And as we find out through our growing years, that what we thought was the world was not at all so. And as we grow into what we call maturity, our perception of the world just grows, well, more true, more complete. But through the senses is how we see. And one of the limitations of senses, well, it has many limitations, but one of the limitations of senses is that it reduces things to form. It reduces to small space. So when we look, we see here, for example, the ground. The ground looks like it's solid, it is some kind of granite, but we cannot see what's below. You may have heard recently, there have been many cases of what they call sinkholes appearing. On the internet, you might find some interesting photographs which have been circulated on emails, where in a city, in the middle of a cross, two roads are crossing. At the center of the road, suddenly one day the soil just broke and fell through several dozen meters, a big round hole. For all the years before the cars were crossing over, nobody could see that there's a big hollow below, until the hollow became so big that the road couldn't be supported and the road just fell through. What's below here, we cannot see. What's behind the wall, we cannot see. So practically our senses reduce the reality to the range that they can see and the surface appearance of what is. This looks like a bag. When you go through the airport X-ray, they stop your bag and take it out. It looks like you have a knife, a bomb, or whatever it is they're afraid of, and they want to check, is it true? There's an appearance and your sense mind constructs danger. Now this sense mind is also tied to the working of the emotional mind slightly. So when our emotional mind is agitated, the sense mind gets warped. The classic example given is in the evening when the sun is setting and the light is dim, if there is a rope on the ground, you look, and if you think of snakes and you're afraid of snakes, your sense mind's perception is warped. Ah, that must be a snake. I think it moved. I'm not sure, but it looks like it moved. Did it move? Maybe it moved. You see, the whole reaction of its constructed idea, which may have nothing to do with reality. Now this sense mind, when it looks at the world, what does it see? It cannot see the divine. It can only see sensory appearances in finite pieces. If somehow this layer of the sense mind could be opened up to see fully, let's take an extreme example. You look and you see right through all these different objects. You see right through the ground into all that is below. You see all the way into infinity, the whole universe around you, above, below, around, with your sight. And not only you see everything, you see the tiniest detail of everything, all the atoms everywhere. Not only you see the atoms of form, you see also their energies. You see the beams of light energy flowing between atoms all over the universe. Not only you see the energy, you see the consciousness behind the energy. Streams of consciousness flowing in gigantic waves in the whole ocean, fine threads spreading out all over. You look at the flower and you see millions of streams of light going all around the universe, connecting the flower with the whole universe. And you see and you touch and you feel and smell and hear the fine vibrations of all these streams of consciousness, and you experience it in your hearing as this extraordinarily beautiful music, like an orchestra of 1,000,000 instruments. And you feel the touch of all those vibrations as perfectly harmonized with everything else. And if in your heart you feel the consciousness, you feel the love that pours through it all. And very quickly, what you would be experiencing would be nature of the divine consciousness in the physical world. Through the physical senses, fully awakened, when they act no more as a veil, but as a means of perception. But unfortunately, our senses are shut, narrow, tight, bordered, and I see flower, table, object, and the world is reduced, the divinity of the world is reduced to appearances of forms and objects. And so this is the first screen of the sense mind in the very initial emergence in our evolution as we emerged through the worm all the way to human development. But well, we are much more sophisticated than the worm. We have also on top of the sense mind, the emotional mind, which adds another layer. And so the emotional mind is the one which made the rope appear to be like a snake, which gives an emotional value to objects. So a piece of, let's say you have food before you, I like this, I don't like this. Strong association, strong fixed ideas. I look at people, I like, I don't like. I look at situations, I fear this and I'm comfortable in that. And I begin to put strong emotional values which again warp the whole perspective of the universe. What if your emotional being, your emotional mind was not so bound, was not so limited? What if again, like the sense mind, it could open out into the infinity? What would you experience? You would look at every object and you would experience in your relation with each object colors of delight. The delight of something which is too intense, from which you wish to withdraw, something which is too attractive, to which you're drawn to, and all as ranges and colors of a play of delight. Not only it is something outside you, but it is equally inside your totality, because your own emotional mind consciousness, being liberated from its narrowness, would be one with the universe. You'd feel everything inside you. And everything being inside you, as I look at this flower, it's already inside me. I don't need to reach out and possess and take, because it's already inside me. It's mine. I own it perfectly. And in my ownership of it, I enjoy somebody else taking, smelling, or doing something with it, as much as I enjoy my taking and smelling. They're all equivalent experiences and colors of delight in the universe. And in this way, when we begin to identify and experience the universe, we would be experiencing the divinity in and as this emotional experience of the cosmos. And more than that, we have also built up a third screen, which is the intellectual mind, which also creates a barrier. And the intellectual mind gives mental values to all of these experiences. Over time, we have learned to consider certain things to be good and certain things to be bad. Now, if you look at animals in the forest, they play emotionally, but they don't have this intellectual value system. They don't think of things in terms of good and bad. The lion is hungry, well, it's going to catch the closest deer that it can. When it's not hungry, you'll sometimes find deer playing around near it. It looks at them and says, don't bother me. I'm the king. You are just playing around. Nothing. But when it gets hungry, it will get up and chase and find something to eat. Is it being good when it allows them to play? Is it being bad when it kills? It doesn't exist. The concept doesn't exist. You look at the working of the forest, there is nothing which you can call good or bad. Everything serves a purpose. Everything flows and is part of an overall movement that maintains the totality. You remove one of these pieces and the harmony is broken. The human intervention is what makes inevitably bad. We rarely do something good. Even when we think we are trying to help, what we try to do often ends up disbalancing, breaking the harmony. That's the nature of the thinking part of the intellectual mind. And so assigning these values of good and bad, which are artificial, we begin to try to live by those artificial good and bad values. And so we warp ourselves. I've often experienced this in situations when dealing with parents or even students. They will come up with some strange question like, how should we manage pressure of life, let's say. So if I ask, what do you mean by pressure of life? Difficult situations where somebody is upset, what should we do? I said, if I push a little further and say, give me an example, what is it? Well, my relative, whoever it is, often it's a mother-in-law, my mother-in-law is always abusing me, is always dominating, is always saying these nasty things to me. And what you're asking for? The question was, how can I manage to bear that, survive that? Something's wrong there. Shouldn't you be responding rather than simply suffering in silence? No, that thought didn't come. Because the good thing is always to be polite and nice and never to push back, right? So you're trying to fit yourself into a little shell of your own mind's construction of what is good, dealing with everything else in terms which you have, so to say, programmed or brainwashed yourself, or society has brainwashed yourself to be. And we end up living a life which is utterly artificial, where all our relationships are warped, and life itself and the purpose of life has been so badly warped that we have forgotten why we are here or what this is all meant to be for. You're busy chasing, I need to earn money, I need to do this, I need to do that. The goals have been set, and you're chasing some fake idea of what life is meant to be. And you expend your whole life and energies chasing after this until eventually, exhausted, you look back and say, what did I do? What was the point of it all? And if somehow this intellectual screen can be removed so that you can see things for what they actually are, everything there is an aspect of the divine, working on an aspect of the divine to push forward the emergence of the divine. Just to put it in very simple terms, maybe a little abstract. Within us is a divine potential, and every pressure of life is upon us to push forward, to draw out, to fulfill something of the divine potential. And a bit like the forest, everything is helping everything else. And when we begin to see things like that, all we see is one gigantic being, that is the universe, in which each one of us is like a conscious center, a cell or individualized center. And everything in this gigantic being is struggling to push forward to reveal more and more of its divinity. And we are as if focal points for this forward movement of the divine awakening. And everything given to you in your life circumstance is meant somehow to help. Sometimes to help by drawing out, sometimes to help by pushing in so that you may push back. So even problems come in order to provoke a correction or a readjustment, to draw out possibilities simply by crushing them further. We see this often in large cycles of humanity, where an entire civilization is subjugated, sometimes for centuries, and then it manages to build the strength to push back and emerge. And you can see, yes, so much was lost, but also so much was gained in the power to push back and emerge. A strength, a kind of a humility, a certain respect for the complexities of dominance and subjugation. Sri Aurobindo makes this very interesting observation in one of the Thoughts and Aphorisms, where he says that a civilization which has not experienced slavery is not ready for leadership. Very interesting idea. It's only when you have experienced what it means to be subjugated that you can be an effective leader, because you know what not to do and what is the right relation that you need to set in that role of leadership. But everything serves somehow in the same kind of flow that you see in the forest. Everything is essentially good, warped perhaps in its external appearance, and so on. But the point is, you would see one giant being pushing forward its movement of unfolding evolution of divine possibilities, of which we are each one special focal points. It's as if the whole universe is one being trying to wake up, to express and manifest its divinity, depending on us in a way as focal points to push forward the cutting edge of the rest of it which has to follow. So I've dwelt on these three veils in some detail as more as examples so that we understand what he means when he says that the veil of the intellectual, emotional, sensational mind which our ordinary existence has built between us and the divine. Meaning, in fact, the divine is there. It's these three veils which prevent us from relating to and from perceiving the divine. Everything is essentially divine, isn't it? We know that, but somehow we can't see or feel that because of these veils. So, if we can break down the veil which our ordinary existence has built between us and the divine, we can then take up through the truth mind all the mental, vital, physical experience and offer it up to the spiritual. So this truth mind being the link principle, it can take up all that is below and offer it up to all that is above. To be converted into the terms of the infinite truth of Satchidananda. By this offering, it will be converted into that truth. And then he puts in a parenthetical comment, this was the secret or mystic sense of the old Vedic sacrifice. The word sacrifice is another problematic word, and we keep it because that's how it has been conventionally translated. But the word in the Veda is yajna. And Sri Aurobindo, in one of his articles, goes into the etymology of the word yajna. And yajna literally means the active expression of the divine. Yajna is the divine himself, but in his movement. And so yajna is a process of divinization, so to say. But the form it takes in us is that which is in us still raw and crude is offered up into the larger movement of divinization. And so there is this giving, offering, consecrating. And the common word used is sacrifice because it was associated with a certain ritual form of consecration. So this is the secret or mystic sense of the old Vedic sacrifice. And what is the secret sense of it? That all our mental, vital, physical experience is taken up, offered to the spiritual, to be converted into the terms of the infinite truth of Satchidananda. Now this is a very important idea, and we come to something which is at the very core of the whole Vedic process of the yoga, which obviously is not different from the core of the integral yoga. I want to read two passages from Sri Aurobindo's commentary on the Veda. So the first of them is when he's speaking of this kind of a process, he's describing how he was studying the Vedic yoga, and he said, I had already seen that the central idea of the Vedic rishis was the transition of the human soul from a state of death to a state of immortality. Okay, this is the journey from the lower triple world to the higher triple world. But how? By the exchange of the falsehood for the truth, of a divided and limited being for integrality and infinity. Now the word I'm pointing to is this word exchange. Exchange of the falsehood for the truth. Exchange of the divided and limited being for integrality and infinite. Now, if you think of the word exchange, it means this goes there and that goes here. That means falsehood is given to the truth and truth is given to the falsehood. But if you think of it more deeply, then the whole sense of it becomes obvious. Why doesn't he simply use the word replace? Replace falsehood by the truth. Why does he say exchange? Because when you look at the whole question deeply, the falsehood here is so deep-rooted. It's in the very nature of the mind's working. Because mind is made of a piece, and piece working with pieces. You cannot avoid error, you cannot avoid ignorance, you cannot avoid falsehood. It's inevitable. The only way you can get free of the falsehood is if this thing gives itself to that which does not have these limitations. But that's not enough. Giving this to that is not enough. That must then give itself to this. That must enter here and work here by its rules. The truth should enter here and unify, put in right relation. That's why the exchange. There has to be this double movement. It's not enough to have a one-way movement. There's a very interesting word he uses here. So I look at another similar passage. He's describing the crooked path of our journey. You know, we wander through life. And then the straight path, which is the yoga. So in this passage he says, so must man, their posterity, exchange the crooked movements of the separative consciousness for the straight things of the truth conscious mind. So again there's an exchange. The crookedness must give itself to the straight path of the truth, and the truth must give itself, that is, must accept to enter this consciousness to bring itself here and transform it. And that's why the exchange is so important. It's not replacing one by the other. It is a movement of exchange. And so it is this which he is referring to when he speaks of, we can take up through the truth mind all of our mental, vital and physical experience and offer it up to the spiritual to be converted into the terms of the infinite truth of Satchidananda, and we can receive the powers and illuminations of the infinite existence in forms of a divine knowledge, will and delight to be imposed on our mentality, vitality, physical existence. So there are two movements. This part gives itself to the higher, and the higher equally pours to be received in forms of divine knowledge, will and delight. Now these three words are mapped on these three parts, imposed on our mentality, vitality and physical existence. So the knowledge fills our mind, the will fills our vitality, leads its impulses and actions, and the delight fills our sense perceptions, and we begin to see and perceive the divine delight in everything. Till the lower is transformed into the perfect vessel of the higher. And so here is the most critical concept. Through this exchange, the lower remains no more what it was. It becomes fundamentally different, is reshaped in the image of the higher by a slow process. Fast, doesn't matter, slow or fast, by a gradual process, until the higher can make it a perfectly fit instrument for its action. And this is the key point. It can go all the way to becoming a perfect vessel of the higher. When the higher begins to act on it, or when it gives itself to the higher in order that the higher may act on it. So through this exchange process, something can happen which transforms fundamentally the working of the lower until it is capable of becoming and becomes eventually the perfect vessel for the higher. Now at that point what happens? The higher and the lower are still experiencing a continuum, but the lower now can fully express the higher without distortion, without dilution. The lower shares in the full experience of the higher, and yet keeps its distinctive character, which is what? Form, separation, multiplicity. So we can still appreciate the flower as an object which is apparently separate. But of course now we experience in the character of the Satchidananda the underlying oneness in which we are all one, and yet now we can play in the joy and delight of the separateness. We can act in the spontaneous working of the divine will in us and with the full knowledge and awareness of the divine knowledge. But for this double exchange to take place, we need the link point through which alone this exchange is possible. How is the mind to give itself to that which is above? How is that which is above to pour into the mind? There has to be the linking principle. And it is this now which he has pointed our attention to, the link between the spiritual and the lower planes of the mental being. The Vijnana. This, he says, and he links it to the Vedic yoga, this was the double Vedic movement of the descent and the birth of the gods in the human creature, and the ascent of the human powers that struggle towards the divine knowledge, power, and delight, and climb into the Godheads. So this description is so valuable because it summarizes the whole process of the Vedic yoga. But the result of that, the result of which was the possession of the One, the Infinite, the beatific existence, the union with God, the immortality. And possession where? Here, now, in the body, in the world, in the full revealed play of the divine in the world. By possession of this ideal plane, remember this is the link point, this is the principle we have to now tap. By possession of this ideal plane, we break down entirely the opposition of the lower and the higher existence. The false gulf created by the ignorance between the finite and the infinite, God and nature, the one and the many. It had a false gulf so far, and that's gone with this principle. Open the gates of the divine, fulfill the individual in the complete harmony of the cosmic consciousness, and realize in the cosmic being the epiphany of the transcendent Satchidananda. This is the goal towards which this whole journey is taking, and the purpose of the cosmic consciousness in the yoga is to attain to this level of completion, not stop short halfway. That in the cosmic consciousness, the individual consciousness is fulfilled in perfect harmony with the cosmic, and the cosmic reveals the Satchidananda's transcendence and all the infinite possibilities and riches to pour down from it to manifest in the cosmos through the individual. The individual, the cosmos, and the transcendences and their enormous possibilities, all of these are aligned in one single perfect continuum. So this is the conclusion of this chapter, where he is pointing to what the cosmic consciousness must lead to for its perfection. So we close with a short concentration and chant of Om together 3 times. And we'll continue next Friday. Om.